Imagine, imagine you're deciding whether or not to spend like 3 hours of your weekend watching this massive, epic, historically significant biographical film.
Okay.
And before you buy the ticket, you look up a review. But the reviewer, they don't show you the sweeping cinematography. They don't mention the brilliant script, and they completely ignore the Oscar-winning performance at the emotional climax of the movie.
Right, they just skip all the good stuff.
Exactly. Instead, the only thing they broadcast to you is a 3-minute blooper reel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, just the lead actor stumbling over his lines,
Yeah.
tripping over a lighting cable, looking completely foolish behind the scenes, and then looking right into the camera. The reviewer tells you, this is the entire movie. It is a complete disaster.
So they frame the whole thing around the mistakes.
Right. And if you only saw that blooper reel, you would believe them, right? Why wouldn't you? Well, according to the book we are unpacking today, that is exactly how the mainstream American media treated Donald Trump's relationship with Black America.
It's a wild premise, for sure.
It really is. We are stripping away the political noise today to look strictly at the data, the policies, and, a narrative that completely shatters conventional wisdom.
It really is a profound paradigm shift when you look at it through the lens of this specific source text.
Yeah.
The book is titled Unmasking the Media, The Truth Behind Trump's Relationship with Black America. And what it attempts to do is curate a highly specific, deeply researched collection of economic data points, legislative achievements, and historical relationships.
To build a totally different case.
Exactly. To build a case that runs entirely counter to the prevailing cultural memory of that administration.
Now, before we take a single step further, let's lay down some very firm ground rules for this deep dive.
Yes, very important.
We are dealing with intensely polarizing, politically charged source material today. This touches on themes that ignite fierce, unrelenting debates across the entire political spectrum, from the far left to the far right.
Oh, absolutely.
So to you, the listener, we want to be crystal clear. We are not taking sides.
Right? Zero sides here.
We are not here to endorse the viewpoints presented in this book.
Yeah?
And we're not here to debunk them or offer counter-arguments from outside sources either.
We're just looking at the text itself.
That's it. Our only role today is to act as your analytical guides. We're here to impartially convey, deconstruct, and examine the mechanics of the arguments contained strictly within the pages of this text. We want to understand how the author constructs these points and, why they matter.
Exactly. We are operating entirely within the closed universe of this book. And inside that universe, the baseline assumption, like the core thesis, is that Donald Trump's presidency actually delivered significant, highly tangible, and specifically targeted policy benefits that elevated the African-American community.
Which is, that's not what you usually hear.
Not at all. We are talking about historic economic metrics, absolutely unprecedented funding for educational institutions, and a landmark overhaul of the criminal justice system.
Right.
But the crux of the author's argument is that these very real, very measurable achievements were purposefully suppressed.
Suppressed and overshadowed.
Yeah, overshadowed by a media apparatus that was, according to the text, singularly obsessed with painting him as a racist.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because whether you are listening to this as a staunch conservative, a progressive Democrat, or, a completely disillusioned independent, the pure contrast presented in this text is just fascinating.
It's a massive disconnect.
Huge. How does a presidency manage to generate record-low minority unemployment while simultaneously generating record-high accusations of racial animus?
That's the million-dollar question.
It's a masterclass in how information is filtered to the public, how historical legacies are manufactured in real time, and ultimately, how you and I are forced to make civic decisions based on the realities presented to us.
Absolutely.
So let's start where the text starts, the economic engine.
Let's do it. Picture a modern, open-concept office space. Exposed brick walls, natural light pouring in, and a diverse group of young entrepreneurs gathered around a massive oak table.
Okay, I can see it.
They are collaborating, maybe passing around a prototype for a new tech device, mapping out a business plan on a whiteboard. This is the exact reality the text focuses on when outlining the first major pillar of this relationship.
Which is what? Yeah.
The intense focus on empowering African-American business owners and expanding minority entrepreneurship.
I love focusing on the entrepreneur because economics can get so abstract so quickly.
Oh, definitely.
We hear phrases like macroeconomic indicators and our eyes glaze over. But the book grounds this in a very specific, aggressive economic philosophy. Mass tax cuts combined with an absolutely ruthless campaign of deregulation.
Yes.
Now, the text argues these weren't just broad, generic Republican talking points. It posits that these specific levers were pulled because they disproportionately benefit minority communities.
And the proof they constantly point back to is the record low African-American unemployment rate right before the pandemic hit.
But how? Like, let's get into the mechanics of that.
Yeah. The mechanics are the most important part of the argument. It's not just about pointing to a line graph trending downwards.
Right. It's about the cause and effect.
Exactly, the cause and effect that created the trend. The book explains that lowering corporate and individual tax rates, while simultaneously slashing bureaucratic red tape, well, it attacks the barriers to entry.
Barriers that have historically kept minority entrepreneurs locked out of the market.
Precisely. Let's look at red tape, for example. Complex regulations, endless licensing requirements, zoning laws, compliance audits.
All the boring stuff.
Right. But those things require money to navigate. They require specialized lawyers and accountants.
Right, which massive multinational corporations already have. I mean, they have entire floors of lawyers in skyscrapers just waiting to fill out compliance forms.
Exactly. A Fortune 500 company doesn't care about a new, complex zoning regulation. They just absorb the cost.
It's a drop in the bucket for them.
But for a first-generation African-American entrepreneur trying to open, say, a logistics company or a neighborhood bakery or a mid-sized tech firm, that regulatory red tape is a brick wall. The argument here is that systemic overregulation is inherently regressive.
Because it targets the little guy.
Right. It disproportionately chokes out those who don't have generational wealth or endless capital. So by aggressively removing those barriers, the administration aimed to democratize the very act of starting and scaling a business.
It makes me think of like a highway system. Imagine you are trying to drive your business from the starting line to profitability.
Okay.
But every 100 feet on this highway, there's a toll booth representing a different regulation, a different tax, a different licensing fee.
I like this analogy.
Now, the massive 18-wheeler corporations, they have an easy pass. They just blow right through. The tolls are automatically deducted from their massive bank accounts, and they don't even slow down.
Yeah, they don't even feel it.
But the new minority business owner in a compact car, they have to stop at every single booth. They have to scrounge for change. Sometimes they have to park the car and wait until they can afford the next toll.
Which kills their momentum.
Exactly. Eventually, they just run out of gas. What the book is saying is that the administration's policy was essentially to just bulldoze the toll booths, let everyone drive.
That is a brilliant way to visualize the economic theory the authors are presenting. The text argues the administration recognized that the traditional system heavily penalized the new player.
Right.
And sought to create an environment where minority businesses could accelerate without being nickel and dimed into bankruptcy by the state.
Hold on, though. I have to challenge the logic here based on how the book presents this.
Okay, go ahead.
Because if he is just cutting corporate taxes across the board, isn't that just classic trickle-down economics rebranded? I mean, how does the book prove this was actively tailored for minority communities rather than those communities just catching the runoff of a massive corporate windfall that was designed to help billionaires?
That is the exact nuance the text anticipates and addresses.
Oh, they cover that.
They do. The authors concede that tax cuts and deregulation are, by nature, broad macroeconomic sweeps. However, they argue the administration paired these broad strokes with highly targeted, hyper-specific geographic investments.
Okay, what kind of investments?
The key mechanism the text highlights here is the implementation of opportunity zones.
Oh, this is crucial. Break down exactly how an opportunity zone works, because it sounds like a political buzzword, but the financial mechanics of it are actually wild.
It really is a profound piece of economic engineering. The text explains that historically, when a wealthy investor makes a massive profit selling an asset, say stock or real estate, they get hit with massive capital gains taxes.
Right. The government takes a huge cut.
Exactly. But under the Opportunity Zone legislation, the government offered a deal. They said, if you take those massive profits and invest them directly into designated economically distressed zip codes.
Zip codes that are, I assume, disproportionately urban and minority communities.
Yes, exactly. If you invest there, you can defer, reduce, or even completely eliminate your capital gains tax.
Wow. So instead of that money just sitting in an offshore account or being reinvested in Silicon Valley, It's being legally redirected into communities that have been starved of capital for decades.
Exactly. The book frames this not as a happy accident of trickle-down economics, but as a deliberate, engineered funnel.
They force the money there.
Well, they incentivized it heavily. They intentionally changed the tax code to make it incredibly lucrative for billions of dollars in private capital to flow directly into African-American neighborhoods.
So fund startups, build housing, all that.
Yeah, and revitalize infrastructure. That is how the authors justify the claim that the resulting job growth was a primary goal, not just a byproduct of a rising tide.
But here's the thing about a booming, deregulated economy filled with opportunity zone capital. It doesn't mean anything if the people living in those zones don't have the specialized skills to actually capture that wealth.
That's a very fair point.
Right. I mean, if billions of dollars flow into your neighborhood to build a new green energy plant, but you don't have an engineering degree, you aren't getting the lucrative management job. You're just watching the gentrification happen from the sidewalk.
Which is a huge fear for a lot of these communities.
Exactly. Which brings us to the next massive piece of the puzzle the text explores, the educational foundation.
Let's shift our mental image here. Imagine a classic, sprawling college campus. Beautiful red brick buildings covered in ivy, grand white columns, huge old oak trees, shading pathways filled with students carrying textbooks.
Debating philosophy, heading to the science labs.
Exactly. This is the reality for students at historically black colleges and universities, or HBCUs. And according to the source material, ensuring the survival and expansion of these specific institutions was one of the absolute hallmarks of Trump's presidency.
The detail the book goes into regarding HBCU funding is staggering. We aren't talking about a quick photo op with some college president.
Not at all.
The text highlights that the administration secured billions of dollars in federal funding across his term. But I want to dig into the why.
Okay.
Why is a targeted, specific investment in HBCUs structurally different from just increasing the general federal education budget for all universities across the country?
What's fascinating here is how the text points to the unique historical vulnerability of HBCUs.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, unlike massive Ivy League institutions or state flagship universities that have multi-billion-dollar endowments to fall back on during hard times, many HBCUs have historically operated on incredibly tight margins.
They just don't have the safety net.
Exactly. They have been chronically underfunded for generations.
Yeah.
If a general economic downturn happens, a school with a $50 billion endowment barely notices.
They might have to pause a new building, but they aren't closing.
Right, but in HBCU, they might have to cut vital academic programs or defer crucial maintenance just to keep the lights on.
So a general federal education increase might give a tiny bump to an HBCU, but it also gives millions more to Harvard, which doesn't need it.
Exactly. The book argues that by legally mandating and locking in this unprecedented level of funding specifically for HBCUs, well, they changed everything.
Wait, they locked it in?
Yes, most notably, making the funding permanent rather than forcing these college presidents to come to Washington every year to beg for temporary grant renewals.
Oh, wow, that's huge. So they can actually plan for the future.
The administration fundamentally altered their trajectory. The text details how this capital injection wasn't just used to keep the lights on. It allowed these institutions to dramatically expand their STEM programs.
High-paying fields.
Right. It allowed them to build state-of-the-art technological infrastructure, ensuring their graduates are highly competitive in the modern workforce.
And it creates a pipeline. This is where the book's narrative really starts to weave together for me.
How so?
Well, if you connect the economic deregulation from the first point to this educational funding, it's a deliberate 1-2 punch.
Ah, I see what you're saying.
The text is basically saying, we are going to use opportunity zones to flood your community with business capital, and simultaneously, we're going to fully fund the exact universities that are going to teach you how to build the business that captures that capital.
It is absolute synergy. The administration's theory, as presented by the authors, was that you cannot have economic liberation without educational empowerment.
It makes total sense.
By securing the future of HBCUs, they were directly equipping African-American students with the networks, the degrees, and the technical knowledge required to dominate the very business world they were actively trying to deregulate.
But, and this is a massive but that the text pivots to,
Yeah.
you can have the most brilliant business plan in the world.
Right.
You can have a degree from Howard University in one hand and Opportunity Zone funding in the other. But if your community is being disproportionately ravaged, surveilled, and dismantled by a fundamentally broken legal system, that economic engine completely stalls out.
It stops completely.
Right. If the young men and women who are supposed to be building these businesses are instead being locked up for decades due to draconian sentencing laws, the whole system collapses.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the administration's approach to criminal justice reform.
Imagine the heavy iron gates of a federal penitentiary slowly grinding open.
Okay.
The sun is setting, casting a warm light, and a group of individuals are walking out of those gates carrying whatever belongings they have left, stepping back into the free world to return to their families.
That's a powerful image.
It is. This is the visual representation of the rehabilitation and second chance philosophy embedded in the legislation the text focuses on most heavily, the First Step Act.
The First Step Act is framed in this book as a monumental, almost miraculous piece of bipartisan legislation, especially given the incredibly toxic political climate it was passed in.
It's definitely an outlier for that era.
To get Republicans and Democrats to agree on overhauling the prison system is wild. And the text points out that its primary target was the dismantling of mandatory minimum sentences, specifically for nonviolent offenders.
Which is a huge deal.
We really need to explain what a mandatory minimum actually does in a courtroom, because it's terrifying when you break it down.
It is. The text provides the context that stems largely from the tough-on-crime era of the 1980s and the 1994 crime bill.
Right, where everyone was trying to out-tough each other.
Exactly. The overarching philosophy then was punitive deterrence. The legislature essentially took the power away from the judges. A mandatory minimum means that if a person is convicted of a specific crime, often related to nonviolent drug offenses, the judge is legally required to hand down a predetermined, mathematically fixed prison sentence.
The judge has no say.
Usually an incredibly long one, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, regardless of the context.
It's like a medical system where the law requires a doctor to perform aggressive open-heart surgery on every single patient who walks in the door with chest pain.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Think about it. It doesn't matter if the patient is having a massive heart attack or if they just have a slight case of heartburn. The law says chest pain equals open heart surgery.
That's terrifying.
The judge, who is the doctor in this scenario, is not allowed to look at the individual patient, assess the severity, look at their medical history, or show any discretion. They just have to order the surgery.
Yeah.
In the justice system, this meant young men, overwhelmingly from minority communities, were getting locked away for decades for first-time nonviolent offenses.
And the text points out the devastating downstream effects of this. It didn't just punish the individual, it removed fathers, brothers, and sons from the community.
Which completely destabilizes the social and economic fabric of those neighborhoods.
Exactly. The First Step Act, according to the book, gave the judges their diagnostic tools back.
They let them be judges again.
Right. It retroactively applied the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentences, a disparity that notoriously targeted Black Americans. Wow.
It allowed for thousands of inmates to petition for immediate release, and it placed a massive new emphasis on good time credits and actual rehabilitation programs to prevent recidivism.
But wait, this is where I struggle with the narrative the book is weaving.
Okay, what's the issue?
How do the authors reconcile the mechanics of the First Step Act, which is fundamentally an act of leniency, compassion, and reducing the prison population, with the intensely aggressive law and order rhetoric that Trump was constantly broadcasting?
Yes.
I mean, we all heard the speeches. It was very tough on crime, very back the blue. It seems like a massive contradiction to scream law and order at a rally and then go back to the Oval Office and sign a bill letting thousands of people out of federal prison.
It is a profound tension, and the text spends a lot of time analyzing this exact dynamic.
How do they explain it?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the authors frame this not as a contradiction, but as a highly calculated, pragmatic balancing act.
A balancing act between what? The argument is that the administration recognized two simultaneous truths. First, that urban communities genuinely suffer from violent crime and desire strong, effective policing to keep their streets safe.
Sure, nobody wants violent crime in their neighborhood.
Exactly. That satisfies the law and order mandate. But second, they recognized that the system of policing and sentencing was undeniably racially skewed and fundamentally broken regarding nonviolent offenses.
So they were trying to thread the needle.
Exactly. The text suggests the administration believed you could be unapologetically tough on violent crime and gangs while simultaneously dismantling the draconian laws that were unfairly trapping nonviolent first-time offenders in an endless cycle of mass incarceration.
Protecting them from the criminals and from the state at the same time.
The book presents this as a uniquely pragmatic approach, protecting the community from actual danger while saving the community from the overreach of the state.
Okay, but let's be real about Washington, D.C. Passing a bill like the First Step Act, which undoes decades of entrenched federal law, doesn't just happen because it's a good idea.
No, definitely not.
It requires leverage, it requires immense political capital, and most importantly, it requires alliances. You do not get a bill like that to the resolute desk in a highly polarized environment without a vast network of people pulling the levers of power behind the scenes.
And this is a huge part of the book.
When I was reading this section of the text, I actually had to stop and check the citations. The book maps out a network of alliances that completely challenged my assumptions about who was actually in the room making these policies happen.
This is where the source material actively begins to deconstruct the popular narrative of isolation. The text provides a massive, incredibly detailed roster of prominent African-American leaders, politicians, activists, and cultural icons.
Who were actually working with him.
Right, who not only collaborated with Donald Trump on these policies, but in many cases considered him a genuine friend.
The sheer diversity of the list is what stunned me. The text points to long-standing historical relationships with foundational civil rights figures like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton.
Yeah.
New York Times, they praised his corporate initiatives in the past. It outlines a deep bench of highly influential political figures. Senator Tim Scott, who was instrumental in the Opportunity Zones, Representative Byron Donalds, Docter Ben Carson, running HUD, Burgess Owens.
A very deep bench.
We are talking about grassroots leaders and policy wonks. And then, completely out of left field, the text dives into his alliances with massive cultural icons and hip-hop moguls. People like Lil Wayne, 50 Cent, Ice Cube.
And Kodak Black, actually.
Wait, interrupt yourself for a second. Kodak Black. Kodak Black is actually cited in a book about presidential policy and criminal justice reform.
He is, and it is entirely relevant to the text's argument.
That is wild. How?
The book uses these cultural alliances to prove that the administration's outreach wasn't just confined to stuffy Washington think tanks or traditional political circles.
They were reaching out to pop culture.
Exactly. By engaging with figures like Ice Cube on his contract with Black America, or commuting the sentences of artists who had become entangled in the very justice system the First Step Act was trying to reform, well, the administration was signaling a willingness to meet the culture exactly where it was.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The text goes even further back than that, which I think is vital for the context of who this guy actually is.
The historical background.
Right. The book takes us back to the 1990s and early 2000s. It details Trump's incredibly close social ties and philanthropic overlap with Bill and Hillary Clinton, his appearances on mainstream talk shows where he was lauded as a brilliant businessman, his awards from urban coalitions.
He was a pop culture staple.
The book uses this historical evidence to assert that Trump's alliances have always crossed party lines. He was a guy who operated on mutual interests, personal relationships, and pragmatic goals, rather than rigid, unwavering political ideology.
That's a crucial part of the author's argument.
But if that is true, if we accept the book's premise that in the 90s he was this pragmatic, cross-aisle socialite working with Jesse Jackson and the Clintons, how on earth do we reconcile that historical figure with the deeply polarizing, incredibly controversial political figure that descended that escalator in 2015?
It's a stark contrast.
Did the man himself undergo some sort of fundamental, radical change in character? Or did the alliances shift around him?
The source text is unequivocal on this point. It asserts that Donald Trump did not fundamentally change his core approach to relationships or his prioritization of results over ideology.
So what changed?
What changed, according to the book, was the political landscape, the perceived threat to the establishment, and most critically, the media environment. The authors argue that the moment he announced his candidacy as a Republican, specifically a Republican who was actively bypassing the traditional gatekeepers, the political cost of associating with him became astronomically high.
So his old friends couldn't be seen with him anymore.
The text argues that the alliances didn't dissolve because he suddenly changed his views on minority communities. They dissolved or were publicly disavowed because the media apparatus made it socially and politically radioactive to support him.
And that transition is perfectly laid out by the authors. Because if you step back and look at the aggregate of what the text has presented so far.
Yeah, let's summarize that.
If a candidate has this vast, diverse network of relationships spanning civil rights leaders to hip-hop billionaires, if they secure historic permanent funding for HBCUs, if they pass landmark, bipartisan criminal justice reform, and if they engineer an economy that drives minority unemployment to record lows.
You would logically expect that candidate to be universally celebrated.
Exactly. You would expect glowing profiles in the New York Times. You would expect massive parades. But they weren't. In fact, the cultural reaction was the exact opposite.
Which brings us face to face with the core antagonist of the source text.
The mainstream media.
Picture a stark, hand-drawn television set. The screen is glowing an eerie, static blue, and flashing across it in bold, aggressive red letters are the words, "Fake news."
Oh, that's a perfect visual for this.
The antenna is bent, the image is slightly distorted. This is the central visual metaphor for the text's most aggressive thesis, the concept of intentional media manipulation and absolute narrative control.
The book does not hold back here. It doesn't accuse the media of simple bias or sloppy journalism. The text explicitly posits that the mainstream media apparatus actively, consciously, and strategically employed tactics to completely discredit him.
They say it was intentional.
The argument is that they intentionally buried the HBCU funding, they ignored the opportunity zones, and they downplayed the First Step Act, replacing all of that tangible policy data with a relentless 2047 narrative determined to label him as fundamentally, irredeemably racist.
According to the authors, this was a calculated political tactic designed specifically to sever his potential ties with black voters.
So they were trying to break up the coalition before it started.
The text argues that by focusing the news cycle exclusively on polarizing rhetoric, unscripted controversial tweets, and intentionally divisive sound bites, the media created an airtight, skewed, alternate reality.
Like a filter bubble.
Right. If the only thing a voter ever sees on the evening news is an out-of-context quote designed to generate outrage, they are never going to know about the billions of dollars flowing into their local university.
It goes right back to the movie review metaphor we started with. The media only showed the blooper reel, and they hid the Oscar-winning performance.
Spot on.
But I have to push back here because this is the trickiest part of the book's thesis. We are dealing with a totally unprecedented historical figure.
Okay, let's hear the pushback.
Is it possible, looking objectively at the text, that there wasn't some smoky backroom conspiracy among journalists to hide his achievements? Is it possible that his own rhetoric, his constant Twitter feuds, and his combative, unfiltered style were just so incredibly loud that they naturally drowned out the dry, bureaucratic news of policy enactments?
You mean he sabotaged his own messaging?
Yeah. Sometimes the noise is just so deafening that nobody can hear the signal. Did he sabotage his own narrative?
It is a highly critical point, and the text does grapple with the sheer undeniable volume of his rhetoric. However, the authors maintain that even if the rhetoric was loud, the media's disproportionate coverage still amounted to a systemic institutional failure.
Because they chose what to broadcast.
Exactly. The book firmly views the editorial choices, like the decision to place a controversial tweet on the front page above the fold while burying a multi-billion-dollar HBCU funding bill on page 14 as a deliberate choice to provide an unbalanced view.
They had a duty to cover both.
The text argues that it is the fundamental duty of the press to cut through the noise, to analyze the signal, and to report on the tangible ways the government is altering the lives of its citizens. By prioritizing the blooper reel, the authors argue, the media actively robbed the electorate of the ability to make fully informed decisions based on policy outcomes.
Which leads us to the ultimate question of this entire deep dive, the climax of the book's analysis. When the dust finally settled, when the television was turned off, and the ballots were actually cast, what happened?
The moment of truth?
Did the media's alleged strategy of alienation work flawlessly? Or did the voters see through the noise, look at their own bank accounts, look at the new businesses opening in their neighborhoods, and make a completely different calculation?
This source material concludes by shifting away from theory and diving into the actual empirical voting data from the 2020 election.
And what does the data say?
What the text highlights is a distinct, highly measurable increase in support for Trump among black voters, particularly black men, compared to historical Republican benchmarks from previous decades.
So it wasn't a total realignment, but the margins moved. And in tight elections, margins are everything.
They absolutely are.
The text views this shift as absolute, undeniable proof that the black electorate is not a monolith. They do not vote in a single, predictable, easily manipulated bloc based purely on historical party loyalty. The book argues that despite the most pervasive, overwhelmingly negative media narrative in modern history, a critical percentage of black Americans recognized the tangible benefits of the administration's policies.
They saw the reality around them.
They saw the results of the First Step Act when their neighbors came home from prison. They witnessed the HBCU funding, securing their children's education, and they voted on that reality rather than the reality presented on their television screens.
Exactly. The text emphasizes that this demographic shift, however incremental it may seem in raw percentages, represents a seismic shockwave in political strategy.
Because it breaks the mold.
It demonstrates that a growing segment of the electorate prioritize their lived economic reality, their employment status, their business growth, their community safety, over the media's portrayal of the candidate's character.
I want to talk directly to you, the listener, right now. Put yourself in the shoes of a voter standing in the privacy of the voting booth.
It's a tough position.
If the television, the newspapers, and the cultural elite are telling you 24 hours a day that this leader is a fundamental threat to your existence, but your own community is seeing record low unemployment, your local HBCU just received a massive permanent federal grant to build a new robotics center, your uncle just came home from federal prison 10 years early because a judge was finally allowed to use discretion under the First Step Act.
Yeah.
How do you cast your ballot? How do you weigh the chaotic, terrifying reality on the screen against the thriving, tangible reality on your street? Is it a profound, almost impossible civic dilemma?
This raises an important question that the text spends its concluding chapters exploring. What is the actual future of Black American politics?
What's their prediction?
The source material suggests that the administration's unorthodox outreach, combined with these specific policy successes, has permanently altered traditional political loyalties.
So the old playbook is dead.
The book argues that moving forward, neither the Democratic nor the Republican Party can rely on historical alignment or media narratives to secure the Black vote. They are going to be forced to compete on the actual grounds of tangible economic empowerment, measurable educational investment, and physical, real-world results.
The bar has been permanently moved from soaring rhetoric to cold, hard reality.
Exactly.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's take one final look at the intense, almost unbelievable contrast presented in this text. We have walked through a book that outlines a presidency defined, in its own view, by historic economic and educational strides for Black America.
Right?
We've explored the mechanics of how deregulation and opportunity zones cleared the toll booths for minority entrepreneurs. We've seen how permanent HBCU funding built the educational pipeline to capture that wealth. And we've analyzed how the First Step Act attempted to heal the deep wounds of the 1994 crime bill.
It's a lot of policy.
And we have seen how every single one of those tangible achievements ran in direct, violently opposed contradiction to a media narrative that sought to paint the administration as fundamentally antagonistic to those very communities. It is a story of two completely different realities fighting a brutal war for the belief of the American voter.
And as we leave you today, I want to offer a final lingering thought for you to mull over on your own, something that builds on the very foundation of everything we've unpacked today.
Let's hear it.
If we truly live in an era where massive, world-altering policy achievements and pervasive, inescapable media narratives can exist in completely different, contradictory, isolated realities, how do you, as an independent thinker, as a citizen who has to vote and live in this society, decide what truly defines a leader's legacy?
Wow.
Do you measure their impact by the specific laws they signed and the actual money they allocated to your community? Or do you measure it by the cultural atmosphere they cultivated and the headlines they generated?
It is the defining question of our modern information age. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly detailed deep dive. We encourage you to keep asking these hard questions, to keep looking beyond the immediate headlines, and to always examine the source material for yourself. Until next time.